This third lecture, we're going to talk about one of the fundamental elements of economics, which is supply and demand, or demand and supply, or supply and demand and supply and demand. So the intersection of demand and supply is really, and how the demand and supply interact with each other is called the market. Supply, demand, equilibrium, and market for goods and services are going to be the first section. Then we're going to look at shifts in demand and supply for goods and services. Then we're going to look at changes in equilibrium, price, and quantity. It's a four-step process. We'll walk through those quickly. Fourth, we're going to talk about price ceilings, price floors, and what those do to supply and demand and market efficiency. And then we'll talk about demand, supply, and efficiency generally. So why do organic vegetables cost more? Well, organic vegetables and fruits are grown and sold within a specific geographical region. They can't be transported long distances because otherwise you'd have rot. And in theory, they cost less than conventional produce because transportation costs are lower. That's not usually the case, though. Normally, the cost is higher, and that's caused by an imbalance in supply and demand, which causes the price to rise. As is typical as we go through these lectures, I'm going to start off with some definitions so we're all on the same page when I'm using some of these terms. So demand is the amount of some good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. Price is what a buyer pays for a unit of the specific good or service. Quantity demanded is the total number of units of a good or service consumers are willing to purchase at a given price. The law of demand says that keeping all other variables constant, if the price goes up, then the quantity demanded goes down. If the price goes down, then the quantity demanded goes up. That's generally going to be the case. We can look at demand in terms of curves. And as I had mentioned multiple times in the course, curves are like fundamental economic stuff. A lot of things, pictures worth 1,000 words, and curves tend to give us a really good picture of how economics works. So the demand schedule is a table that shows the ranges of prices for a certain good or service and a quantity demanded at each price. And then a demand curve is a graphic representation of that table. And it shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded of a certain good or service, with quantity on the horizontal axis and price on the vertical axis. So here's a typical demand curve. The points on a demand schedule are graphed, and then the line connecting them is drawn, and that gives you your demand curve. The downward slope of the demand curve, again, it illustrates the law of demand, that the higher a price, the lower amount is demanded. So in this particular case, you can see that at $1 per gallon, 800 million gallons are demanded. At $2.20 per gallon, 420 million gallons are demanded. And this has a downward sloping curve starting from the left and going to the right. Offsetting demand is supply. Supply is the amount of some good or service a producer is willing to supply at each price. And a quantity supplied is the total number of goods or services a producer is willing to sell at a given price. And the law of supply, assuming all their variables that affect supply are held constant, if price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. If price goes down, quantity supplied goes down. Again, assuming that the producers are profit maximizers and are trying to get the most money they can. Just like demand, supply has a supply schedule, so that's a table that shows the quantity supplied at a range of different prices, and a curve, which is a graphic illustration of that supply schedule, of the relationship between price shown on the vertical axis and quantity shown on the horizontal axis. So here's a typical supply curve. Supply curve is created by graphing the points from a supply schedule, then drawing a line and connecting them. The upward slope of the supply curve illustrates that the law of supply holds, which is at $1 per gallon, only 500 million gallons are going to be produced, and at $2.20 a gallon, 720 million gallons are going to be produced. So the supply curve is downward sloping from right to left. Economics operates in terms of equilibrium, and equilibrium is where supply and demand intersect. It's a combination of supply or of price and quantity where there's no economic pressure from surpluses or shortages that would cause price or quantity to change. where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So basically, we'll see this in a moment, where those two graphs intersect with the supply line and the demand line intersect. That's going to be your equilibrium point. The equilibrium price is a price where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. The equilibrium quantity is a quantity at which quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal for a certain price level. Surpluses are excess supply. So at the existing price, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and shortages are the opposite of that. It's at the existing price, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. So in this particular case, where we graph the supply and demand curve, these are those two curves put on the same graph. The demand curve and the supply curve intersect at the equilibrium point, which is this point E right here in the middle. The equilibrium price is the only price where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. You can see it at every other point that the two lines don't intersect. At a price above equilibrium, quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, so there's excess supply. And at any point below, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, so there's excess demand. And so in this particular case, the equilibrium price is $1.40, and the equilibrium quantity supplied is 600 million gallons. Talking a little bit about shifts in the curve. So ceteris paribus, you'll hear me use that term frequently, is Latin phrase meaning all other things being equal. So if I say, this price change or the quantity demanded change, ceteris paribus, that means all other things being equal, something else, one factor changed. Any given demand or supply curve is based upon ceteris paribus assumption that all else is held equal. The demand curve, so here's the demand curve. It can be used to identify how much consumers would buy at any given price and quantity demanded. Shifting the demand curve, when you hear a shift in demand, that means that the demand curve is actually moving in that. So it's not going up and down that same line. It means that whole line is moving. If income increases, for instance, consumers will purchase larger quantities, which pushes demand to the right, thus causing the demand curve to shift right. So shifting demand curve, increased demand means that at every given price, the quantity demanded is going to be higher, so that demand curve shifts to the right from D0 to D1. So it goes from D0 here to D1. A decreased demand means that at any given price, the quantity demanded is lower, so that the demand curve shifts from D0 to D2. So you can see if it's a increase in demand, it goes this way. If it's a decrease in demand, it goes this way. And the whole line, the whole demand curve shifts. So what factors affect and will cause a shift in demand? Well, a shift in demand happens when change in some other economic factor other than just a price causes a different quantity to be demanded at every price point. So factors that can affect demand are rising or falling incomes, changes in taste or preference, changes in the composition of the population, price of substitutes or complements. We'll talk about those here in a bit. And then changes in expectations about the future. So for instance, horses and buggies, there used to be a relatively high demand for horses and buggies because that was a primary form of transportation. Once tastes or preferences changed to the automobile, the demand for those went down, and the demand curve shifted to the right, to the left. The quantity demanded decreased, and then of course supply begins to decrease and the price adjusts accordingly. So a list of factors that can cause an increase in demand from D0 to D1 right here would be, greater popularity, population likely to buy rises, income rises, price substitutes rise, price of complements fall, future expectations encourage buying. And then for decreases in demand, less popularity, population drops, income drops, price substitute falls, price for a complement rises, and future expectations discourage buying. So when I talk about complements and substitutes, what does that mean? So let's define that. A normal good is a product whose demand rises when income rises. So as you get more income, you want to buy more of something. An inferior good is a product whose demand falls when income rises, and vice versa. A substitute is a good or service that we can use in place of another good or service. So, horses and buggies versus cars. And complements are goods or services that are often used together, so the consumption of one good tends to enhance the consumption of another good. So horses with buggies or gasoline with cars. The supply curve can be used to show the minimum price a firm will accept to produce at a given quantity of output. Again, we talked about this in the gasoline example. The supply price is the cost of production plus the desired profit. That equals the price that a firm is going to set for that particular good. Because the cost of production and desired profit equal the price a firm is going to set for the good, if the cost of production rises, the price for the product also needs to rise. Otherwise, a firm could go out of business because there's no profit or they begin to generate losses. We talk about this a lot in the microeconomics class. So when we shift the supply curve, what happens? Well, when the cost of production increases, so you have an increase in the cost of production for any reason, the supply curve shifts up to a new price level. So you can see a shift in the supply curve here. A decreased supply means that at any given price, the quantity supplied is lower, so supply curve shifts to the left from S0 to S1. And an increased supply means that at any given price, the quantity supplied is higher, so the supply curve shifts to the right from S0 to S2. So what factors will cause that to happen? Well, shifts in supply is when a change in some economic factor other than the price causes a different quantity to be supplied. Inputs or factors of production tend to drive that. That's a combination of labor, materials, and machinery that's used to produce goods or services. So factors that impact supply tend to be natural conditions, input prices, technology, government policies. And how do they impact? Well, you've got the situation here where supply is increased because natural conditions for production become more favorable. There's a fall in input prices like labor or raw materials. You have improved technology, which makes production more efficient, or lower product taxes and less costly regulations will cause an increase in supply because all those tend to cause structural increases in the cost of production, and you've got to have, and supply is driven by cost of production plus profit. On the other side, you've got poor natural conditions will drive it down, rise in input prices, decline in technology, which is very uncommon, and higher product taxes causing more costly regulations. So looking at changes in equilibrium price and quantity, there's a 4-step process determining how economic events impact the equilibrium price. First is draw your supply and demand model. Before any economic changes take place. So where supply and demand, let's figure out where the equilibrium point is. Then decide whether that economic change, whatever it might be, affects supply or demand. And normally it doesn't affect both. Sometimes it does, but normally it doesn't. So does it affect supply or demand? And then decide whether the effect causes a curve shift to the right or to the left and sketch the new curve. And then 4, identify the new equilibrium and then compare to the original. So I can give an example. I'll give an example where it impacts, one change can impact both curves. You have an increase in the minimum wage. So the increase in the minimum wage will cause demand to rise because income rises. So the demand will shift up because you've got increased income. However, the cost of production also increases because the labor rates increase, and so supply will shift down. So now what you've got is supply shifting down and demand shifting up. You have both curves move, and what you may end up with is no additional consumption, but just wage inflation. And so the price goes up, but the quantity remains the same, and there's no real economic benefit conveyed to anybody. So example question, shift in supply using a 4-step approach. How did excellent weather conditions during the summer increase the effective quantity and price in salmon? So you had great salmon weather. So as a result, you started here at S0 where a pound of salmon the equilibrium price is going to be about $3.25 to produce 250,000 fish. Now you have great weather, so supply shifts out because you had favorable natural conditions. So now the price goes down to $2.50, and the quantity supplied goes up to almost 600,000 fish. So again, price went down and quantity supplied went up. So again, you've got a new equilibrium price at 250, and you've got a new equilibrium quantity at 550. Again, the demand didn't change, but the amount supplied did, and so that, as a result, created a new equilibrium point. Could have the same thing happen in demand. So from 2004 to 2012, the share of Americans who reported obtaining their news from digital sources increased from 24% to 39% using the four-step approach. How did the consumption of traditional sources such as print news media and radio, television news? So you started out at E0 and S0, so that's your original supply. Then you have a decrease in the quantity demanded for traditional media. So the demand shifts backwards because of technological changes. So as a result, the price that you're able to get for advertising dropped from P0 to P1 as the equilibrium point fell. So the supply remained the same, but the quantity demanded, or the demand, decreased, and so as a result, you ended up with lower quantity at a lower price. So using the four-step approach, what does an increase in labor compensation, as well as an increase in digital communication, suggest about continued viability of the Postal Service? Well, again, we talked a little bit about this. Email is substituting out for a lot of the Postal Service, and you have increasing wages as well as benefit costs associated with the Postal Service. So higher labor compensation causes a leftward shift in the supply curve. So the supply curve shifts to the left, which decreases the equilibrium quantity and increases the price. And then you have a decrease in demand because you also see a leftward shift in demand curve, which causes a decrease in the equilibrium quantity and decrease in equilibrium price due to substitute goods and technology. So as a combined example, you superimpose both of those, a shift downward in supply and a shift downward in demand. And what you end up with is a price that kind of sits over here with a new supply demand, where you've got a higher price but significantly lower quantity than you had at zero, even though the price has gone up just a little bit. So that little increase in price caused a significant decrease in quantity, which does not bode well for the long-term viability of the Postal Service. And this is kind of a real-world example. So movements along are different than shifts. So a shift in one curve does not necessarily cause a shift in the other curve. Rather, a shift in one curve causes a movement along the quantity demanded. So if you have, this shifted from S0 to S1, the equilibrium moved from E0 to E1. So it moved along the quantity demanded changed. Demand didn't change. This is a change in demand, is a shift in the curve. This is a change in the quantity demanded, which is a movement along the curve. Price ceilings, price floors. Sometimes government regulation will cause price controls to go into place. So that's going to be things like the minimum wage, rent control. It allows the government to regulate prices for things. A price ceiling keeps the price from rising above a certain level. It's a legal maximum that someone can pay for a good or service. For instance, you may have a price ceiling and rent control. A price floor keeps the price from falling below a certain level. It's the lowest price that one can legally pay for some good or service. Think about the minimum wage as the example. So for rent control, the original intersection of supply and demand occurs at E0, which is right here where you've got demand and supply. And that's where the equilibrium would be. So you'd have 15,000 rental units at $500 a month. If demand shifts from D0 to D1 over here, the new equilibrium price would be at E1. So you'd end up at $600 per rental unit, and you'd end up at 17,000 rental units. However, if the price is not permitted to rise, so if the price is fixed at $500 per unit, the quantity supplied is not going to go up. Why? Because the supply didn't shift. And so as a result, this is all that's going to be supplied is 15,000 units. However, the demand at 500 is going to be out here because the demand shifted. And so there's going to be demand for almost 19,000 units, but only 15,000 is going to be supplied, which results in a housing shortage. So again, if you have rent control, and if the rent controlled price is below the price that a natural supply and demand curve would set, you're actually going to have housing shortage. A price floor example, this uses European wheat. I tend to like to use minimum wage because we can relate to it a little bit more, but the book uses European wheat, so I use European wheat. The intersection of supply and demand is right here at E0. So the price is going to be P0, and the quantity supplied is going to be Q0. However, if there's a price floor, and that price floor is up here, there's going to be a supply of wheat. They're going to want to supply wheat here at QS, but people are only going to demand QD because the price floor is set up here. So what you're going to have is an excess supply. You're going to have a surplus. You're going to have producers producing more wheat than they can sell because folks don't want to buy it at that price. So you'll have a surplus of wheat or surplus of labor. Surplus of labor is called unemployment. But if you think about this in terms of minimum wage, if the price floor is set here, and you've got this many people willing to work for that new higher minimum wage, but this many jobs available because the demand didn't shift, now you've got increased unemployment. A little bit about economic efficiency. Consumer surplus is the amount that individuals would have been willing to pay minus the amount that they actually paid. So that's the area above the market price and below the demand curve. Producer surplus is the price a producer actually received minus the price a producer would have been willing to accept. That's the area between the market price and the supply curve. Social surplus, economic surplus, total surplus equals the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. So the two together is a total social surplus, the economic surplus, the benefit that goes into the economy. And deadweight loss is a loss in social surplus, so the loss that occurs when a market produces in an inefficient quantity. And again, the theory behind economics is we want to always be at the efficient level, at the efficient frontier, at the production possibilities frontier, and we don't like deadweight loss conceptually. However, we talk a lot about this in micro. We'll talk about this again in macro. There's policy reasons why you might force a deadweight loss into a market. So here's an example of consumer producer surplus. The somewhat triangular area labeled by F right here is the consumer surplus, which shows that the equilibrium price of the market was less than what a lot of people were willing to pay, because people would buy at 120, 10 people would buy, or 10 million people would buy. So there's a surplus here. At the producer surplus, a somewhat triangular area here in G shows a producer surplus, which shows that they would have produced at lower prices. So they get a surplus here as well. So this entire area is the social surplus, is basically the amount where it's win-win. Everybody wins in this scenario because these folks would have been willing to produce and they got more, and these folks would have been willing to consume and they paid less. Efficiency and price floors and ceilings. Again, when you've got a price floor and price ceiling, you cut off some of that efficiency. So the original equilibrium price at 600 with a quantity of 20,000, the consumer surplus is T and U, and the producer surplus is V, W, and X. So that's what we just saw. That price ceiling now gets imposed at $400. So now there's a price ceiling at $400. Now what happens? Well, in that particular case, the new producer surplus is X. We lose V and W. And the new consumer surplus is T and V here, because this is all that's going to be produced. And so you actually lose U and W, and U and W become your deadweight loss, because you're basically only producing, you're only going to get production at this level. Up here, if you let the market function, you'd get economic surplus or producers or a social surplus of T, U, V, W, and X. When you put the price floor in, you only get T, V, and X, and U and W become a deadweight loss. Same thing when we look at the price floor. If you had I, J, K, H, I, J, K, and G, and this was the original social surplus. Once you put the price floor in, again, you now cut off J and K. This becomes your deadweight loss. This social benefit disappears, and essentially in this particular case, the there's additional G, H, and I become the new social surplus.